Hi everyone and welcome to the 12th Daily Critique. Today I'm going to be discussing 5 images by Uzman. He's preferred to keep his second name anonymous, but all 5 images are of a really high technical standard, so this video is mostly going to focus on composition. So let's get going. So these are the images that Uzman sent over, and obviously a very beautiful collection here. So we're going to go through them one by one as usual in Photoshop. So we'll start with this one, which I absolutely love, and at the same time can't decide how I feel about the composition. We've got the sun here on the left and this tree on the left, and then quite a lot of empty space to the right. So you'd almost want this the other way around, with the sun on the opposite side to counterbalance the tree. And yet the light of the sun shining through the tree works really well. The edit is absolutely perfect. The highlights are blown around the sun, but not in a way that's unpleasant. And what that creates is a very natural sense of luminance in the image. So in this case, I think it was a good decision to let those highlights disappear. And the little hint of magenta that's effectively been introduced, I think, is actually really effective in creating that warm sunset feel. Looks almost like it's shot on Velvia, were it not for the fact that the contrast is, of course, a lot less than you might see on a slide film like that. On that end, maybe I'd like just a tiny bit more contrast. We can have a quick play with that just to see how that looks. Yeah, so just to deepen the shadows slightly, it perhaps just looks a little bit too bright in these shadowed areas. But a really, really lovely image this, and whilst the composition may not be ideal, it also doesn't feel wrong. So really like this, and a lovely example of a eucalyptus tree too. Okay, now a very illustrative, technically accurate, nicely arranged image here. The structure is great, with all these interlocking layers coming through, and then gradually dropping off into the distance, running through the haze. So a really strong sense of depth coming from that haze, which is one of the reasons why you wouldn't necessarily want to remove haze, even if you could in many images. I had a look at the edit. It's been really tastefully done. I would say that aside from this crag feature here, there isn't really a strong focal point, but I'm not sure that particularly matters, because that layering effect is so effective, and I love how understated this image is. So another really good shot there. This one, kind of in a similar vein in many ways. Obviously doesn't have that layering effect, but it is a very simple structure. You've got lots of diagonal lines all feeding down into an almost tree-like structure of all these valleys here. So that's quite effective. In this case, I probably do want a focal point to hang the image off, if you like. It might work well as a set, but I think as a more abstract image, a more intimate shot, it doesn't work quite as well without that focal point. I also suspect that this is just very slightly off being level, because if I quickly draw some lines here through the trees, you see they all really lean off to the left, one way or another. So maybe that needs a quick rotation just to correct that. But really nicely handled. The only slight niggle I'd have, obviously there's a fair amount of saturation brought in here, which actually doesn't look wrong, except for these trees at the top. Just getting a bit too fiery there perhaps. Onto this fourth image, really beautiful twilight shot. In fact, I asked Uzman if this was Tasmania, but apparently it's, I think he said Victoria, anyway, mainland Australia. Lovely dead bushes or trees, whatever these are here. Great texture and detail in the midground, which is fantastic. You've got this amazing detail of the moon, which has been beautifully handled. You can see all of the detail there rendered perfectly, and that's a big part of getting your timing right when you're shooting full moon shots, because around the full moon, almost every full moon of the year, as the moon breaks the horizon, there's an element of fill light that comes from the setting sun, or the reverse at sunrise and moon set, and it's that fill light that allows you to perfectly balance the exposure of the moon with a twilight lit landscape. So this has been timed to perfection, and it's also been edited brilliantly. On the compositional side, I don't have a problem with these rocks in the foreground, but they're not as good as they could be in an ideal world. Certainly they just feel a little bit well, for a start, focused on the far right hand side, a little bit blocky. I'd love to see something fill in the gap on this left hand side, and then I think it would become a bit more coherent as a foreground. So maybe there was an opportunity to find something there. But as I've mentioned in previous videos, often composition is an act of compromise, and it may just be that Uzman has found the best compromise here. But really, really beautiful image, and nicely processed. Is this level? Probably not, but otherwise it's great. Okay, and on to this final shot, which is probably my favourite of the bunch, or at least in its potential. There are some things that I would do slightly differently here. The central tree, which makes this beautiful focal point thanks to the lighting on the tree, is perhaps just a little bit hot. It's a little bit too bright and contrasty. So I would have just reduced the exposure locally on that tree, because it's just a bit too bright there. And equally, I probably would just let the foreground here just drop into shadow a little bit more. Obviously, when it's bright like this, it really jumps out at you. But I think if it just dropped into the background a tiny bit more, then you'd still be able to see all those lovely details, and it would work really well. The rest of the image is processed beautifully, and there's some lovely lighting. Compositionally, though, I'm not so sure. Firstly, we have this tree very central, which is fine. You can really focus the interest on a subject by placing it centrally. But in this case, you really don't need to, because the light on that tree is so significant for its appearance in the image. It's the first and last thing that you'll look at for sure. So it doesn't need that central placement for impact. And as a general rule, creating a sense of asymmetry in your images, I think, creates a more visually interesting shot. So aside from convention, rule of thirds, and so on, I really would want to place this off to the left-hand side of the image. And then if I actually break down this image here, there's not really much going on the left hand side at all compared to what's happening on the right. And what I love on the right hand side is we've got this lovely foreground, and then a prominent foreground tree, and then these more distant trees in the midground, and then you've got a clear backdrop too. So you've got this midground on this right hand side that's lacking to a certain extent on that left hand side. And then if you look at the lines running through the left, then they're quite linear by comparison, where you've got a lot more flowing lines, especially in the background on the right hand side of the image. And so for me, the obvious conclusion of all of this is to crop. So I'm just going to lose that left hand side, and then I'll make sure this is unlocked. And I think a composition like that works really well. And again, you can see that the tree happens to be placed quite close to a third. In general, I'd advise turning those thirds grids off, because they'll just influence your composition. And in fact, looking at this now, I think maybe putting the edge of the frame through there might work a bit better. So I will just recrop that again to somewhere there. And I'm not too worried about this tree coming in on the left either, although ideally it wouldn't be there. And what I really like about this composition, this crop, is that it creates a relationship between the tree here and this crag. That to me ties the whole shot together in a way that didn't quite occur when we were seeing the full width of the image. So really brilliant set of images there, Uzman. Particularly liked this last one, and I think it was quite interesting to discuss how the crop might affect the image in this case. So thank you for sending those in.